Y ya estamos en YouTube.
Muy buenas tardes a todos, muy buenos días también, y muy buenas noches, con los distintos usos horarios en todo el mundo. Vamos a dar comienzo a la clase magistral sobre el rol de los parlamentos en un mundo en constante transformación, previo a darle lugar al director de la Escuela de Gobierno de la Universidad Austral, que va a realizar la apertura. Quería explicarles simplemente que tenemos interpretación simultánea, español-inglés e inglés-español, así que les sugiero a todos que miren a su derecha, donde van a ver un mapa mundi, y allí podrán elegir las opciones de inglés o español, e inclusive tienen la posibilidad de apagar un sonido de fondo para escuchar 100% el idioma de su preferencia. Así que sin más, le damos la palabra al doctor Alfonso Santiago. Muy bienvenidos a todos. Adelante, Alfonso, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan. Muy buenas tardes aquí en la Argentina, a cada una y a cada uno de ustedes. Como director de la Escuela de Política, Gobierno y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Austral, es para mí una enorme alegría poder estar presentando hoy ante la sociedad el Centro Internacional de Estudios, Investigación y Perspectiva Parlamentaria, CDIP en sus siglas en español, que forma parte central de nuestro proyecto de la Escuela de Política, Gobierno y Relaciones Internacionales. La Escuela de Política, Gobierno y Relaciones Internacionales se define como una aliada estratégica de los distintos niveles y de los distintos órganos de gobierno de nuestro país y de la región de cara a tres objetivos fundamentales. El primer objetivo es la mejora de la calidad institucional, de modo que gradualmente nuestras democracias vayan perfeccionando sus instituciones y vayamos realizando ese sueño de ser realmente un Estado constitucional de derecho. Junto a esa mejora de la calidad institucional, queremos colaborar activamente con los distintos niveles de gobierno para tener una gestión de calidad, tener políticas públicas de calidad que produzcan bienes públicos de calidad y accesibles a todos. Y finalmente, queremos estudiar y aportar para que la Argentina y los distintos países puedan tener una adecuada inserción en nuestra región y en el mundo global. Y de cara a estos tres objetivos fundamentales que tiene la Escuela de Gobierno, poder crear este Centro Internacional de Estudios, Investigaciones y Perspectiva Parlamentaria es algo que está plenamente alineado con esa misión nuestra. Queremos trabajar con los congresos, con las legislaturas provinciales y locales, con los consejos deliberantes, de cara a esos tres objetivos: la mejora de calidad institucional de los poderes legislativos, la mejora de la calidad de gestión mediante una legislación realmente basada en la evidencia, con regulaciones que satisfagan los estándares científicos que hoy nos piden, y no hacerlo esto de modo aislado, sino plenamente insertados y creando una comunidad entre todos los poderes legislativos de nuestro país y de la región. De algún modo, el gran desafío que tienen los parlamentos y los poderes legislativos en el siglo XXI es esta mejora de la calidad institucional, de la mejora de la calidad de gestión y esta articulación entre ellos para transmitirse esas buenas experiencias y ayudarse a mejorar sucesivamente o progresivamente su desempeño para servir mejor a la sociedad. Esta creación del centro, de algún modo, no es algo, diríamos, repentino, sino que tiene una prehistoria. Desde hace unos años atrás, nosotros venimos trabajando en el Programa Internacional de Diplomacia Parlamentaria, la diplomatura en Diplomacia Parlamentaria. Desde hace tres años pusimos en marcha la diplomatura en Derecho Parlamentario, y junto a eso hemos realizado un número importante de investigaciones, todas las cuales ustedes las pueden consultar en la página del Centro Internacional de Estudios, Investigación y Perspectiva Parlamentaria. Hemos ya realizado 4 libros que acabamos de subir a la página, que allí están. Por lo tanto, queremos hacer investigación, queremos hacer docencia y queremos hacer transferencia, especialmente orientada a la mejora de la calidad institucional y gestión de los parlamentos. No solamente nos hemos mantenido dentro de esta docencia e investigación, sino que hemos hecho extensión. a través de jornadas tan importantes como el diálogo entre ciencia y parlamento, con la participación de Peter Gluckman, presidente de la Red Internacional de Asesoramiento Científico Gubernamental, de Marga Soler, joven líder global de los foros económicos mundiales, y de quien hoy nos acompaña, Gabriela Cuevas Barrón, presidente honoraria de la Unión Interparlamentaria. También hemos organizado una jornada sobre las novedades del derecho parlamentario en el Congreso de los Estados Unidos, con la participación del doctor Alfredo Vítolo. Y también una jornada de técnica legislativa en derecho comparado, nada más ni nada menos, que estuvo a cargo de la doctora Piedad García Escudero Marqués, jefa del Departamento de Estudios Jurídicos de la Secretaría General del Congreso de Diputados del Reino de España. Es decir, que este centro, esa calificación de internacional, lo tiene, diríamos, en base a los antecedentes que nosotros hemos estado realizando en los últimos años. De algún modo, hemos tenido lo que aquí se dice, ¿no? La función crea el órgano. Hemos primero tenido actividades, y una vez que tenemos actividades, las hemos encuadrado dentro de este centro internacional que queremos que de aquí en adelante pueda organizar numerosos proyectos de investigación, proyectos de educación y de formación tanto de legisladores como de funcionarios parlamentarios, y también actividades de extensión. Y queremos ser un referente en estos temas, tanto a nivel nacional como a nivel regional y a nivel global. Y es muy importante, y esto lo estamos viendo, cómo estamos llegando, porque tenemos inscriptos en esta primera reunión con participantes de Alemania, de Brasil, de Chile, de Canadá, de Cuba, de Ecuador, de El Salvador, de España, de Estados Unidos, de Grecia, de Italia, de México, de Países Bajos, de Portugal, de Qatar, del Reino Unido, de Gran Bretaña e Irlanda del Norte, de Suecia, de Venezuela y de Uruguay. Por lo tanto, de algún modo, estamos ya llegando no solamente a los referentes nacionales, sino también a referentes regionales y también de otros lugares. No puedo sino agradecer mucho el trabajo de estos años, particularmente de Mariano Palacio y de Juan de Dios Sincuregui, para poner en marcha todos estos, y también la cooperación muy activa que hemos tenido, el acompañamiento de la Fundación Hans Seidel, que permanentemente nos ha ayudado en estas actividades que hemos realizado. Por lo tanto, es para mí un enorme alegría y un enorme desafío la presentación en este centro, de este centro en la sociedad, poder hacerlo hoy con esta fantástica conferencia inaugural a la cual vamos a asistir, y decir tal vez o recordar aquello que decía Heidegger. Heidegger decía, solo lo que comienza es grande. Es decir, porque parece ser que el primer momento donde uno enuncia los distintos proyectos tiene esa posibilidad de soñar a lo grande, de pensar a lo grande. Después la realidad a veces ajusta todos nuestros sueños. Yo me animaría a desafiar a Heidegger, de modo tal de que no solo lo que comience sea grande, no solamente lo que se enuncia sea grande, sino que también sea de calidad cada una de las actividades que organicemos. Esto es un centro abierto a todos los referentes nacionales, regionales e internacionales para que colaboren, para que intercambiemos las mejores experiencias, los mejores estudios, de modo tal de que los parlamentos, los congresos del siglo XXI estén a la altura de los desafíos, de las demandas sociales crecientes de los ciudadanos. Nosotros desde la universidad, que es un espacio de diálogo y de intercambio de experiencias, de estudio, de formación de líderes parlamentarios, queremos contribuir a esto. Finalmente, quiero entonces agradecer a todos los que no solamente han hecho posible que hoy estemos presentando este centro internacional, sino a los que también nos han colaborado desde admisiones de la Facultad de Derecho, desde el Departamento de Comunicación, para que hoy tengamos esta sesión, nada más ni nada menos con Lorna Seitz, para que nos introduzca en algunos de los desafíos que los parlamentos tienen. Bueno, sin más, le devuelvo la palabra a Juan de Dios para que podamos comenzar ya la exposición de Lorna.
Muchísimas gracias, Alfonso. Muy buenos días a todos. Tengo el privilegio de presentar a continuación a Lorna Seitz, responsable de la clase magistral que nos convoca acerca del rol de los parlamentos en un mundo en constante transformación. Cuando desde el CIDEIP, el nuevo Centro Internacional de Estudios, Investigación y Prospectiva Parlamentarios, decidimos organizar esta actividad, nos preguntamos qué cambió desde el origen de los parlamentos modernos hace más de 1000 años. Y bueno, la idea más simple acerca del rol de los parlamentos deriva de su propia denominación, que viene del francés parlement, que deriva del verbo parler, que significa en español nada menos que hablar para luego legislar. ¿Hablar sobre qué? ¿Legislar sobre qué? Sobre los asuntos públicos, sobre las cuestiones atinentes a la vida en sociedad. Hace más de medio siglo que el sociólogo canadiense Marshall McLuhan, junto a otros pensadores de vanguardia, nos advertía acerca de las consecuencias socioculturales que vendrían aparejadas con la revolución de las comunicaciones. La aldea global, ese término que acuñó para describir hacia dónde se dirigía el mundo que conocemos hoy día, lo dice todo. Se refería a la radio, al cine, a la televisión. 3 años después de su muerte, en 1983, nace de forma masiva la Internet, creciendo de forma exponencial hasta nuestros días, acompañando el formidable desarrollo de los medios de comunicación. Posteriormente llegaron los celulares, cuyo número supera actualmente los 7.000 millones en todo el mundo, la gran mayoría con acceso a Internet. En ese contexto, hablar acerca de asuntos públicos se ha vuelto más intenso, más caótico y masivo, y ello ha puesto a los parlamentos y a los parlamentarios a una representación cada vez más desafiante, compleja y sin lugar a dudas a la vista de todos. De los 3 poderes del Estado, el legislativo es el único cuyos debates internos durante el proceso de producción de las leyes se llevan a cabo en forma abierta de cara al público. Por eso nos preguntamos qué tan representativos son los legisladores hoy día, qué tan valorado es su trabajo. Los índices de confianza en los poderes legislativos son cada vez más pobres y preocupantes. Lo mismo ocurre con el apego de la sociedad a los valores democráticos, que ha bajado notablemente en los últimos años, sobre todo en América Latina y el Caribe. La gente empieza a descreer de la democracia y mucho tiene que ver la desconfianza general en la política y en particular en los parlamentos y los parlamentarios. La sociedad demanda resultados. La gran pregunta es si es que podemos hacer algo, cuánto margen de mejora tienen los parlamentos y el sistema democrático en su conjunto. De eso nos hablará nuestra invitada. Tengamos en cuenta que la pandemia produjo estragos en todo el mundo y que ahora viene una etapa de reconstrucción de las instituciones y de preparación inclusive ante eventuales futuras pandemias. ¿Será posible que nuestras instituciones emerjan mejores? ¿Estamos preparados para enfrentar los desafíos que vienen? La política debe tomar nota y estar consciente que vivimos en una sociedad golpeada que intenta superar una etapa de encierro, de penurias y de confusión generalizada. Tal vez sea el tiempo para una revolución de soluciones concretas. ¿Con qué fin? Con alcanzar, aunque sea los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible en los que todas las naciones del mundo, agrupadas en la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, parecen converger, al menos en términos formales. Fin de la pobreza, hambre cero, salud y bienestar, educación de calidad, equidad de género, agua limpia, energía no contaminante, trabajo decente, crecimiento económico, reducción de las desigualdades, paz, justicia y seguridad, e instituciones sólidas. Veremos qué sucede. Vivimos en tiempos de profundas transformaciones. Voy a presentar con esa introducción a nuestra invitada especial. Lorna Seitz es experta en el desarrollo de leyes, de políticas y de programas transformadores. Tiene más de 20 años de experiencia en el desarrollo de políticas, análisis legislativo y reformas institucionales. Se especializa en facilitar procesos colaborativos de resolución de conflictos, promover el compromiso cívico con los procesos de supervisión y formulación de políticas y establecer sistemas para abordar problemas complejos. Ha desarrollado cientos de proyectos de ley e informes junto a legisladores, a funcionarios gubernamentales, a representantes de la sociedad civil y a profesores universitarios, así como planes de estudio para universidades y academias de servicio civil en 3 continentes y más de 40 países. Fue coautora de una serie de libros sobre diseño de políticas basadas en evidencia, evolución legislativa y reformas institucionales. Lorna imparte cursos universitarios sobre legislación, políticas y procesos democráticos. Sus intereses son democracia digital, deliberativa y dialógica, los ODS que mencionábamos y los derechos humanos, la regulación de algoritmos, las leyes que contribuyan a la reducción de las inequidades y situar a la legisprudencia dentro de las ciencias sociales. Lorna tiene un doctorado en jurisprudencia de la Universidad de Boston, una maestría en Derecho Ambiental por la Facultad de Derecho de Vermont y una licenciatura de la Reed College. Es cofundadora y presidente de Legis, una organización sin fines de lucro creada para aprovechar el potencial de la tecnología del siglo XXI para superar las barreras al desarrollo de políticas y leyes inclusivas, receptivas y sobre todo basadas en evidencia científica. Antes de fundar Legis, Lorna se desempeñó como directora ejecutiva del Consorcio Internacional para el Derecho y el Desarrollo, fue directora del programa de redacción legislativa a distancia de la Universidad de Boston College y de la Universidad de California at Riverside. Fue también miembro del grupo de trabajo ADR para la Agencia de Protección Ambiental de los Estados Unidos e investigadora invitada por el Instituto Oceanográfico Woods Hole. Trabajó también para el Usaid y el Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos y para la Organización de las Naciones Unidas en carácter de experta senior en género, en resolución alternativa de disputas, en evaluación de impacto y en fortalecimiento legislativo. Antes de darte la palabra, Lorna, quiero aprovechar para enviar mis saludos a tantos colegas y amigos que veo conectados, con quienes seguramente tendremos la oportunidad de intercambiar opiniones durante el segmento para comentarios, preguntas y respuestas que moderará nuestra gran amiga Gabriela Cuevas Barrón, que por supuesto forma parte de nuestra institución. Ahora sí, Lorna, el piso es tuyo. Te escuchamos con mucho interés.
Okay, thank you, Juan. I'm honored to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how your center evolves and hopefully being able to participate in the activities. So I wanted to, follow up on Juan's introduction by talking about how parliaments can help chart a path to a better future. So law is the means by which society instructs the government which problems to solve and how to direct social and economic resources to achieve policy objectives. So unfortunately, we can't do everything at once. So the members of parliament have to identify the key problems and then develop a prioritized agenda, clarify the objectives, because if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, you don't know if you're successful in achieving it. Develop situationally suitable proposals to achieve those objectives, conduct ex ante legislative assessments of the potential solutions, propose amendments to the bills that have been introduced where needed to ensure that they have a high likelihood of actually transforming problematic behaviors, and establish monitoring and evaluation frameworks. So the Parliament has a large role to play in ensuring that laws are effective and can be implemented. Now, the first bite of this overall project that I wanted to take on was this question of how you identify which problems you should solve and then how you prioritize those. So since we can't do everything at once, we need to prioritize the key problems and put them into a legislative agenda. There are obviously multiple strategies for doing this. The two most common strategies are reactive and ad hoc. So I want to talk a little bit about those. And hopefully those aren't the strategies you have, either of them, but since they are the most common strategies in the world, I wanted to introduce them. So reactive strategy is reacting to a problem that elicits protests or receives a lot of immediate coverage. Now, that sounds like a responsive democracy in some ways, right? However, it can result in disjunct lawmaking efforts where lawmakers come under pressure to enact laws really quickly. So rather than doing what we were talking about in the introductions here and taking the time to conduct research so you can have evidence-based laws, what winds up happening is that laws just are kind of thrown on the books. Frequently, there's a hurried adoption of laws in these situations, and sometimes the laws that are adopted literally say nothing. I have worked in countries where the legislature adopted verbatim a version of the existing law, just in order to make people happy because they acted quickly. So that's a problem. Quickly drafted laws can also conflict with other existing laws. So rather than improving the situation, they can wind up making the laws, the body of law in general, complicated, changing definitions of terms in other laws potentially. Or being reactive simply can mean that you are acting too late to avoid the worst aspects of a problem. So with that, we can kind of think of climate change. If we waited until everybody on the planet was deeply concerned about climate change, it might be too late. So with some issues, it is important to think forward, to look forward, and to get ahead of it. So reactive lawmaking has some distinct problems. The other approach we're likely to see is the ad hoc approach. And this is when policymakers are basically addressing the problems that appeal to them. So the question is, which problems are going to appeal to the policymakers and the members of parliament? It can be issues that they're going to get a political payoff on. So it's good if the issue they're focusing on is something that a large number of voters are demanding that addresses significant interests they're facing. However, it also can be questionable. If the lawmakers are specifically responding to the concerns of their biggest money donors, that can be a problem. It can result in a more divided and polarized electorate. Or if they especially decide on addressing issues in order to distract the public from issues of great importance. Another thing that policymakers might do is address problems that they are familiar with in their personal life. Now, that doesn't sound problematic again, but the problem is that lawmakers typically are in a different situation than the majority of the public, and in a situation that is fairly similar to the other members of parliament. So if they are sequentially addressing the problems that affect them and their closest family and friends and their colleagues, they probably are just progressively addressing issues that affect a small portion of the population over and over and over. And what that can do is it can wind up aggregating wealth in the hands of a few because their issues are being addressed and the issues of other people are being overlooked. In this case, probably because they are not aware specifically of the facts that confront other people. So that's another issue. The approach I would like to recommend is proactive approach. And this was already alluded to again in some of the wonderful introductions when we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. So the proactive approach involves monitoring on legislative impacts to see how the existing laws are working and what progress you are making to obtaining objectives like the Sustainable Development Goals or the objectives that are outlined in your national plan. This strategy assures sustained attention to addressing certain types of problems and accomplishing specific objectives. It can also increase the likelihood that effective incentives will continue to, initiatives will continue to receive funding despite changes you might have in your administration. So it has that sort of consistency impact that otherwise can get lost. Since most countries are committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and do have national plans in place, they already have really broadly defined default policy objectives. However, the legislature has a very key role to play in realizing those objectives. On the most basic level, the Parliament needs to identify why problems such as food insecurity, poverty, health, and gender disparities persist, despite prior and existing efforts to solve those problems. The legislature can further objectives realization by identifying the myriad of patterns of repetitive problematic behaviors that cause these problems to persist, and the causes of these problems, and by developing a prioritized legislative agenda to guide the development of laws that address the causes of the behaviors that result in the most severe and pervasive harms. Identifying problematic behaviors and their drivers lies at the root of developing socially transformative laws. At Legis, we tend to use collaborative systems mapping as a tool for organizing our knowledge on how social institutions operate and for developing testable hypotheses about the pervasiveness of the behaviors identified as problematic. The severity of the harm resultant from those behaviors and the most significant causes of those behaviors. Again, these are hypotheses. They do need to be tested in light of the available evidence. Armed with this roadmap, we can identify the factors that are causing multiple components of this problem or that make it impossible for people to act in the desired manner. We can also consider which problems need to be addressed the most urgently, for instance, in order to protect health and safety or to prevent worse conditions from arising. Which problems are widely recognized and their resolution will thus generate widespread public support, which is important politically and also as far as making sure that the eventual solutions are implemented effectively and rigorously. We also can take into account when we're establishing our legislative agenda, which problems can be addressed quickly and easily. If there's an easy win to take, you probably want to get it underway. And we also want to think about which problems are unlikely to be meaningfully addressed within the resource constraints. So if there's an important problem and you don't have the resources to address it, by all means, do start thinking about a pathway forward, but maybe that is not the first criteria for legislative action. So after considering all these factors and some that may arise to you, that do feel free to add to the chat so we can see what additional factors come to your minds. The individual, like a member of parliament, a political party, a legislative committee, whoever is doing legislative agenda setting, possibly even an NGO, can come up with a prioritized list of problems that need to be solved to achieve the overall rather broad objective, say, ending poverty over time. So that is the basic approach I'm going to introduce right now in terms of legislative agenda setting. As I said, we do tend to use systems mapping, so it is a larger approach, but I am trying to abridge things greatly to stay within the time constraints we have here. Okay, I wanted to also introduce a scientific method that we use for legislative development. This was initially devised by Ann and Robert Seidman, who are professors at Boston University. It's based, though, on methodology of John Dewey for problem solving, which is also in turn based on the scientific methodology. So I tend to think of this as a version of the scientific method that has been applied to the field of law and legislation. So again, our goal here with legislative development is not to create a document full of legal language, but to develop a behaviorally transformative solution and to formalize a realistic implementation strategy. Also, we're going to talk about developing a post-legislative scrutiny framework to improve implementation and outcomes on an ongoing basis. So we need to make sure that the foundation of the law is sound, and then also establish a system for monitoring impacts and trying to improve implementation where we detect problems with implementation, and for addressing changing circumstances, which we are now radically getting with the rise in information technologies and also with climate change, and right now with economic conditions due to COVID. Okay, so how do we design laws to solve social problems? First, we need to understand whose and what behaviors are causing the problems. Then we need to identify why people are doing what they are doing in the face of the law. Legislative's approach to law development, recognizing that people's and civil servants' actions are caused by a wide variety of factors, including legal factors, environmental factors, capacity constraints, socioeconomic pressures, and their ideology. So in order to prove effective, a law must address the causes of these behaviors. So the first thing we look at is what are the problematic behaviors? Second thing we look at are what are the causes of these problematic behaviors? Third thing we'll look at is how do we develop a solution that addresses the causes of these behaviors? And the fourth thing we want to talk about is developing a monitoring and evaluation framework. So as an example of how this works, and I'm going to go through this really quickly because we're just going right through this portion of the talk. I'm sorry, was there a comment that there's a problem with my microphone? No, it's okay. Okay.
Funciona perfecto, ¿eh?
I'm sorry. Trying to present and read in Spanish at the same time is not so simple, sorry. Okay, so one example of how this works, if you were looking at a behavioral problem, we might be concerned about civil registration. So parents may be failing to report a birth. There are a series of causes of that, rules that might not be clear on who is supposed to register a child, so that would be a problem with the law. Opportunity, maybe the new mother can't leave the home because they're in recovery from giving birth, so they can't go to some distant location to do the registration in person if that's what's required. Capacity, they may simply be too busy and then eventually forget about the requirement if they knew about it. Fourth, they might not know they have any duty to report. There might be a fee to register, so there might be an incentive. There are lots of different reasons that we can think of why a parent might not report a birth. Again, these would be hypotheses that we would have to test on the basis of evidence. So if we were thinking about how do we address this problem, we would want to come up with solutions that address each of those factors. So as an example, if the primary problem was they didn't know they were supposed to report the birth, they did not know of their legal obligation, then the solution logically should be some form of awareness campaign, right? So they know the solution should logically address the cause of the problem. However, a lot of laws around the world have a solution that is some form of criminalization or penalization for virtually everything. So if the solution here was they're not reporting a birth, so we are going to levy a fine against them, or maybe there already is a fine and we're going to increase the penalty, that is not going to change their behavior if the reason they didn't register is because they didn't know they were supposed to. So this is basic logic, right? And one thing that I think is very important is to map your law's theory of change. So what are we trying to address? Which behavior do we ultimately want to see transformed? Why do we think that behavior is happening? What is the solution that addresses that cause of the problem? So this is a theory of change that we will see in all good laws, all laws that work. It's hidden usually. And it's important to map it because later that tells us what we can look at in terms of if we're trying to identify indicators of is the law working, we're going to look towards are children being registered? We're going to look towards are the people who are the subject of this particular law, so in this case, the parents, are they changing their behavior? And we're going to look at is the communication program, again, in this instance, actually being implemented? So those types of things. So you're going to be monitoring for various aspects of the theory of change, seeing if they're happening. If we only had a communication program, that was our entire theory of what was causing the problem, and behaviors still didn't change, we would know that that was either not part of the explanation for the cause of the problem, or it was insufficient. So we know we had to change the law. Okay, so sometimes I use the term logical nexus when I'm talking about this and evaluating whether a proposed legislative solution is logically designed to address the causes of the problem. So you'll be hearing that term again, probably. That's why I bring it up. Okay, so I want to talk about, so we now have talked about how you identify key problems or the importance of doing so, the importance of having established a legislative agenda that is addressing the largest problems in your society in a systematic and prioritized manner, and about how you might go about thinking about developing a bill that is likely to work, to be effectively implementable, and to change the problematic behaviors. So now I want to talk a little bit about ex ante scrutiny of bills. So how do we assess them, and what do we do after we've made that assessment? Now, in a lot of parliaments, especially if you're a member of the governing party, you might feel pressured to just vote for whatever bill your party introduces. In some parliaments, the bills are incredibly long, and you literally will not have time to read the bill before you do vote. We get bills in the United States that are thousands of pages. And even if we give the lawmakers a week, the chances of them doing a deep dive into really reading the bill and understanding exactly how it works on their own are fairly minimal. And so we will, at the end of this talk a little bit about research services and their importance in helping with this process. But right now, thinking about what can a lawmaker do after they have been given a bill to assess it and to increase the chances that if it is enacted as a law, it will effectively solve the problem that it is designed to solve. So the first thing we want to do is we want to think about, okay, do we have materials that establish a baseline so that we can have an understanding of what is the problem prior to the passage of the bill and the implementation of the law. This is important, again, when we get into post-legislative scrutiny. We cannot know if our law has been effective if we do not know what the situation was prior to the law's enactment. So we do need to make sure that there is a baseline understanding of the problem here. During the ex ante scrutiny process, we need to consider the impacts of changing circumstances. So if there are probable risks that are emerging, if we can see problems like a high likelihood of inflation down the road, a pandemic, because pandemics are predictable, natural disasters, which again are predictable. We don't know which day they're going to happen, but we do know they will happen. So if we know there's something that is going to there's a high likelihood that there is going to be an event that disrupts the national budget, for instance, or disrupts how institutions are working. How is the law going to work in the face of that? are those probable risks accounted for in some way in the bill, or is there a better way to add provisions to the bill that will help stabilize it against those types of shocks and disruptions? We want the system to continue to function and to continue to make progress towards our objectives realization, even in the face of disruption. So predicting what might happen at the time of drafting and at the time of assessing a bill is useful. We do want to consider if there's a logical nexus between the various solutions that are represented in the bill and the problem. One of the best ways to do this is if there's actually a research document that accompanies every bill that explains the basis for the bill, whose actions are occurring that are problematic, why do we think they're occurring, how does that relate to our solution? If we get a document from a research service that accompanies the bill, it is much easier to understand the fundamental logic. And as a lawmaker, to avoid making changes that destroy that logic. So sometimes during the amendment process, somebody might propose an amendment that destroys the entire logical framework of a bill because they didn't like the sound of a provision and nobody understands its importance. So coming up with a report that helps communicate that is useful. We also want to look at the question of whether implementation of a law is likely. So when we're reviewing a bill, we want to ask questions such as, can the implementing agency do what they are being commanded to do? If we give them tasks that exceed their staff, are we also ensuring that they have additional staff? If we are exceeding their budgetary limits, are we also coming up with a funding mechanism so they can take on the new responsibilities? Have we told them things such as, you need to even drive a prisoner from point A to point B? I've worked in one country where literally it was the lack of gas to pay, to put into the van that was the reason their prisons were completely overcrowded, because they could not transport the prisoners to their pretrial hearings. So as a result, there was a lot of pretrial detention that lasted for many years. So sometimes there are just little incremental problems in terms of the implementing agency's ability to do what the land law commands them to do. And those types of problems undermine your entire solution. So during the ex ante scrutiny process, consider, can the implementing agency do what they are commanded to do? Are they likely to think that it is their mandate, that it's in their interest to do so? Sometimes you might have ideological challenges that you actually need to address within the implementing agency too. You also want to look at the costs and benefits of the bill in terms of who is being benefited. Are there likely to be disparate impacts? So some groups maybe will be benefited more than others. Sometimes that can be part of your proposal and it can be done intentionally. You might want to benefit the poor, for instance, more than the rich in an effort to sort of equalize society more. But if there is a disparate impact that goes against your policy objective or values, or it's unintentional, you just definitely want to flag that and probably address it. You also want to do a technical check. And usually this would fall to somebody on the parliamentary staff, not the legislators themselves. But it is very important to do it. And it is also important to amend the bill according to it. I have again worked in jurisdictions where there are problems with a bill that amount to spelling and punctuation errors. They're obviously more substantive problems. But it seems to me that if there's a spelling error, there should be a mechanism for fixing it. But in some parliaments, the members of parliament are so beholden to their party that they basically feel punished and sometimes are punished if they suggest any amendment, including something that is addressing a spelling error. But if you leave a lot of problems in the bill, and now I'm thinking more of ambiguity in language or a lack of clarity in the bill, what you are going to do is trigger litigation and undermine enforcement. So it is important to address those problems. If you're in a jurisdiction where it's really important to not challenge your party, maybe your party needs to engage in the assessment process and revision process early as a party before they introduce the bill or something. But again, that is another potential problem. So some challenges there with the ex ante process and what we're supposed to do as a result of it. It is also important at that sort of assessment phase to start thinking about how you are going to monitor the bill to see if it is being successfully implemented, and what you are going to do if you find signs that the implementation is suboptimal. If there are implementation failures, if there are abuses of discretion in implementation, if there's biased enforcement in some way, or if your theory of change is basically not working, or if there's a changing circumstance. So what are you going to monitor to determine if the bill is doing what it's meant to do and designed to do? And if not, why not? Because it is useful to include monitoring and evaluation provisions in the bill itself that set into motion a system for people to, on an ongoing basis, consider the bill and the law in that case and how it can be improved. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about now, we have moved from assessing a bill and amending it, hopefully, and developing at least a skeletal post-legislative type scrutiny system, some skeletal monitoring provisions in there so that the data will be collected on an ongoing basis so that when somebody subsequently wants to amend the bill or assess the bill, that the information is already there. It will save you staffing time in the long run and save you delays in responding to the people's needs in the long run. So the next question is post-legislative oversight. So this is basically just looking at, is the law being implemented as intended? We're looking here at implementation. Administrative coordination sometimes can be a problem if there is a need to coordinate between agencies and the bill has not adequately addressed that. Our rules, if there are rulemaking provisions, are those being completed in a timely manner and in a hopefully inclusive and evidence-based manner? Frequently, you'll wind up in the situation where if the rulemaking is not occurring, it is impossible for anybody to actually comply with the law's provisions. Timely enforcement. So if there's a schedule for enforcement, did the people who are charged with implementing those provisions for the people charged with enforcement, did they follow the schedule or were they extremely delayed? You want to look at enforcement prioritization. Are they prioritizing enforcement actions in a way that serves to benefit your objectives the most, that will further the objectives the most? As a drafter or a member of parliament, you do want to include criteria that they will follow when prioritizing actions like enforcement and procedures they will follow. But are they following them? And if you did not include criteria, if you're going back and assessing an older law and there were no criteria to guide enforcement, are their enforcement prioritization decisions optimal? Because if not, you want to probably go back and amend the law, write new law that deals with that and make sure that they're acting in the socially optimal manner. You also want to oversee implementation for evidence of corruption. So if people are literally acting in a way that is prescribed by the law. And for judicial burden. Are any of the provisions resulting in excessive litigation? Again, this is a sign potentially that there's something wrong with the drafting. So it is frequently, in the case of judicial burden, it frequently arises from ambiguities in the law, conflicts between different provisions of the law, those types of issues. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about post-legislative scrutiny. It is a process for identifying and addressing the implementation gaps, failed programs, and equity concerns like disparate impacts. But it also is something that enables the legislature to demonstrate that laws actually solve problems. So I think Juan mentioned the problem that a lot of parliaments around the world are currently facing with low approval ratings and people becoming very, disinclined to trust and support parliaments. If you do good scrutiny of your bills, if you say this is what we're trying to achieve with this, and then you have a way of monitoring it and demonstrating on the basis of reliable, fairly solid, concrete evidence that the bill is achieving what it was designed to achieve, and you communicate this to the people, hopefully with a clear dashboard or something that simplifies everything a lot. That process can increase the sense that there is a purpose for what the parliament is doing and that it is effective. Part of the problem is if you don't communicate your wins to the people, they have a way of forgetting why a law was passed in the first place. So for instance, in the United States, most of our environmental laws were passed, or a whole lot of them were passed in the early 1970s, I believe in 1972. Before they were passed, our rivers were burning. Before they were passed, our air was really hard to breathe. It was highly polluted. After the passage of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, those problems were severely diminished to the point where 50 years later, people sometimes wonder, why do we have all these regulations? They're not pressing concerns anymore. Now with air quality, people are now again concerned because of climate change, but with water quality, I think some of that concern dissipated after the biggest part of the problem was addressed. But of course, the only reason that our rivers are not burning today is because the law is still in force. So it is important to make sure that you tell the story of why it's there, how it operates, and that it is being successful and that it is still important if it is. Okay, so talking a bit more about post-legislative scrutiny, there are different ways you can trigger one of these post-legislative scrutiny processes. You could draft in your bill, or you could draft actually an overall law that says for laws of certain types, after they've been in force for 3 years, 5 years, whatever interval you want to say, we are going to conduct a review to see how it is working, a post-legislative assessment. Now, you probably do not want to require scrutiny of every law and every provision of every law. It could require an exhaustive amount of labor. I think you do want to have monitoring systems that pick up the data you would need and put that in a publicly accessible place. So generate open data that people could use to assess these. But as far as establishing committees within the parliament or within another auxiliary agency to assess laws, you probably only want to do that for laws that are important in some way, or that where you have concerns about what is likely to happen with the implementation, or where you think changing circumstances are the most likely to undermine their efficacy. So you could say, in those specific bills where you think those conditions are applicable, you might have these years in force provision. It goes to review by a certain committee. In some jurisdictions, they have courts have been referring bills back to the committee. So in, I think it is Belgium, if there is a recommendation from the General Prosecutor Department to the that is raised in the annual report saying that there are problems with enforcement and implementation of specific laws, this can go to the Court of Arbitrage or to the Constitutional Court, and that court will refer it back to the Parliament to conduct post-legislative scrutiny on the bill. So that's another potential trigger. But there are also triggers as far as, if you had data and you said that we have to hit this specific threshold, or a review process will automatically be triggered, that is another way it can occur. So options there. Okay, so what are we looking at in post-legislative scrutiny? We're looking at outcomes attainment, whether the behavioral causes are being addressed. We're looking at potentially ideological and attitudinal changes, if that was a big part of the problem initially, and we have a solution to address it. Again, turning to my own country, right now we have a lot of people who are opposed to receiving vaccinations against COVID. If we came up with a proposal that was attempting to convince people that they should get vaccines against COVID, so if we didn't use our power to force them to, but we attempted to convince them, we would be looking for, have we changed their mind? Have they gone and voluntarily done it? We're looking in post-legislative scrutiny at evidence of disparate impacts. So are certain groups being affected differently than others? What this means is that when you are conducting monitoring on a bill, you can't just aggregate the data. And I think Argentina doesn't, but since I'm speaking to the whole world, I know a lot of countries still probably do aggregate data a lot. So thinking about what are the probable impacts we're going to see, which groups are most likely to be discriminated against potentially on the basis of history, or to see it receive laxer implementation or enforcement. Again, history is a good guide there. And to make sure that you are disaggregating data on that basis is useful. So that if somebody wants to look for disparate impacts later, they can. This also, again, if you have open data, and enables members of civil society or journalists to create maps that show which populations are adversely affected. Who do we include in PLS, in post-legislative scrutiny context? We would probably want to talk to the norm addressees, the people whose behaviors the law specifically addresses, the implementing agency officials, intended beneficiaries, professional organizations and NGOs that are interested in this particular problem that the law is addressing, who might have expertise to add to the process, potentially affected businesses or community groups and professionals who are working in the field. And when we talk to them, we might want to, do key informant interviews, focus group discussions, or seminars and workshops, depending on what type of information we need. Those are useful if we need a better qualitative understanding of the nature of the problem, or what experiences they're having, what challenges they're having complying with the law. We also just do want to establish data pipelines so that the data is already there, and possibly web-based complaint and reporting interfaces. So the last thing I wanted to talk about here was the question of how you might go about strengthening parliamentary capacity to solve complex and evolving problems. So how you transition from a reactionary or ad hoc system to an evidence-based system that will progressively realize objectives and adapt to changing circumstances. This requires institutional capacity, and it requires legal structure. So I guess I wanted to see what thoughts you had about what steps you might take with regard to these questions. So, what you might do to expand Parliament's capacity to have the relevant research and facts at the MP's disposal when you are developing policy proposals, assessing policy proposals, things like that. It typically requires a research staff. So I was wondering if there were any concerns there. And I know we have a lot of countries, so I'm not quite sure how this discussion is going to go. legal changes you might want to make also in order to facilitate post-legislative scrutiny and sort of embed those types of processes into your current parliamentary procedures. It might require change of law. And I think that now as we emerge from the pandemic and are willing to take on a more active role as parliaments in thinking about how we can improve our societies going forward, that this might be a good time to start thinking about which procedures might we want to change to make sure that we have a better ability moving forward. So thank you. And I guess I open the floor to questions now.
Muchísimas gracias, Lorna, por la exposición. Muy interesante el paneo amplio por todos los aspectos que supone la experiencia de legislar. Y para el ámbito y el espacio de preguntas y respuestas contamos desde ya con la participación de Gabriela Cuevas Barrón, que es licenciada en Ciencias Políticas en el Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, presidenta honoraria de la Unión Interparlamentaria, que presidió entre los años 2017 y 2020, experta en diplomacia parlamentaria, ha sido miembro de la Asamblea Legislativa de Ciudad de México, senadora y por 3 mandatos diputada federal de México, además de constituyente, miembros de la Asamblea de la Ciudad de México y alcalde de Miguel Hidalgo. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias también, Gabriela, por tu participación. Y bueno, dejamos abierto entonces el espacio para preguntas y eventuales respuestas sobre todos los temas tratados por Lorna en su conferencia.
Muchas gracias, Mariano, Juan, por esta invitación. Lorna, thank you very much for your, I think, super interesting and very well organized presentation. I think this is a very good approach on how to understand how legislators, how parliamentarians should be working. I think that, at least for me, that I was in politics for 27 years, one of the lessons is that we need to legislate, we need to work, having our eyes clearly on data, but also on what's going to happen next. We cannot continue developing laws or presenting bills only after we see something published in the news, because at the end that belongs to the past, that was done yesterday. So I think that we have a lot of lessons from your presentation. Thank you so much. Ahora quisiera dar la palabra a Fotis Fitsilis, director del Departamento de Servicios Científicos de la República Helénica, quien está participando desde Atenas. Muchas gracias y le damos la palabra a Juan. Mariano, si alguien pudiera ayudar a dar la palabra, porque pues yo sabré algo de política, pero de tecnología nada.
Muchísimas gracias, Gabriela. ¿Estás ahí, Fotis?
Yes, I am, indeed.
Bienvenido, adelante, por favor.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am here. Can you hear me? Hello, many greetings from Europe.
Perfectamente.
Many greetings from Europe. It's a very big pleasure to watching this masterclass again, to taking part and to hearing to excellent colleagues like Lorna and the Argentinian colleagues speaking about the institution we all love and we would like to see to flourish and develop in a way that it deserves. I would maybe want to differentiate a little bit from what we have heard till now about the strategies to develop the parliamentary institutions or the representative institutions per se. I would like to speak more about, and to hear, of course, the comments from Lorna and all the rest regarding the digital evolution of parliaments. I am not convinced that the parliament of the future will still not convinced that it will be much different than the one that is today. I think that at least for the near future, the parliament will continue to operate and to function the way we are knowing now, having an additional digital dimension. And I think it will be very hard to change its very nature using these novel technologies like blockchain, Internet of Things, or even artificial intelligence. I think these will be around, but still, I suppose they will be of assistance or assistive tools for human beings to perform the roles that they're performing today. And I would like some comments from our guests today. What are their perception? Because this is my actual field of study, the digital transformation of parliaments. I would like to hear, for instance, Lorna, what her perception of the digital assistant to MPs and parliamentary colleagues. Are we going to be detached from parliamentary operations? Will computers take on the representative functions, or will we continue to serve like today with human beings performing their actual roles as representatives of the people? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fotis. And I believe that perhaps to have the best use of our time, we can have segments of 3 questions before giving the floor back to Lorna for her answers. So the next person that I would like to invite to share his comments is Mr. Anders Johnson. He used to be the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union, so he has a lot of experience working with parliamentarians all over the world. I would like to ask to our moderator, Emilio, to help us giving the microphone to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. I'll do this in English, if you don't mind. It's a delight to be here. I have really enjoyed the presentation made by Lorna Seitz on a subject that interests me greatly, which is the role of parliaments in a world of constant transformation. I loved when you spoke in the beginning about agenda setting, reactive or ad hoc, or what I would say proactive. I would have wished that it was more proactive, as I think we all would have, because then, of course, we would have legislated about the pandemic a long time ago, and we wouldn't have had to wait for the pandemic to hit us. But I think an even sadder example is maybe the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, where I know for a fact that in my country, Sweden, for example, it took them 5 years in Parliament for the agenda to be presented in Parliament. It wasn't like the next day it happened. It took them 5 years. So if it happened, that needed so much time in Sweden, God knows, in other countries. I, like the previous intervener, I also was very curious to see how you would address the issue of the digital evolution. Many years ago, I think it's a decade now, I was with a group of MPs in Asia, and they were talking about the influence of the virtual world they spoke about then, and how it was affecting the parliamentary work, at least in their countries. South Korea was one example that was mentioned, and where they gave us examples of how people were literally able to follow the work of individual MPs on a 24-hour basis. They had access to them through the internet, they could know where they were, and they could communicate with them. And the ones who made the presentation at the seminar where I was expressed some worry about where we were heading, because clearly the internet was in the digital world wasn't interfering, but it was very much present in ways that we maybe didn't think about at all when it was first invented. So I would, like the previous speaker, love to hear a bit more on that, and maybe your views on the subject. I think, for one, that people, you and me, the people, not the representatives, the people are becoming more and more their own representatives. We have all our phones, and our phones are no longer phones. They are means of communicating in a wide variety of ways, and we are expressing our views within seconds of events, or before events, or in between events. We are present as individuals and as communities in ways we have never been before. And therefore, in a sense, one could argue, if we are only looking for having representatives, why would we need them? Because we can represent ourselves. What you see in a number of countries, and I guess my own is no different from others, is that the MPs, they themselves spend a lot more time on social media and on communicating in ways they never did before, which, for an old-timer like me, makes me ask the question, do they have time to listen anymore? Or are they all the time only communicating? I think there is a myriad of questions surrounding the digital world and how it is affecting parliaments that I think merits attention. And for one, I think that parliaments are already changing, and I think that they will continue to change in order to adapt to this new reality. And then just, if you allow me, since I have the floor, one last comment, because I've heard this many times, that there is a growing, they say growing, disenchantment of people with the representatives, with their legislators, etc., that they are not performing. But I would like to suggest that that's maybe not the legislators' fault, that's maybe people's fault. Because we have, as individuals, become so used to expect that we have instant gratification, that we get an instant response to what we want, that we get satisfaction immediately. So we are maybe asking the impossible. And I don't know how to do this, but I would love to see a little bit more of a balance in the public discourse around MPs and parliaments. We should not expect parliaments to do what they can't do, and where maybe they were not meant to do. Having said that, and I will end with this, is that I do think that as we go forward in this world, the oversight function of parliament will become more and more and more important, possibly more important than the legislative role. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anders. Now, bueno, ahora vamos a dar la palabra a Valeria Soler. Le quiero pedir de nuevo cuenta a nuestro moderador Emilio si nos puede ayudar a darle la palabra, por favor.
¿Se escucha? Hello, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to listen to this presentation of Lorna. I'm flattered about it. It's really interesting. My question, it's most connected to the practical application of this problem-solving strategy that she has explained. In our team, as I belong to the team of a senator in the parliament. So I'm very much interested in how to apply the problem-solving strategy and the methodological strategy that she has explained to our daily working routine. So I would like to ask about, as far as I understood, and tell me please if I'm wrong, you use the problem-solving strategy to determine priorities. Once you have determined the priorities, you need to use methodology and then a research method in order to gather data in the process of making a law or a bill. So is it possible for us in the team, without having a committee in the parliament devoted to data gathering, to implement some methods, some traditional methodology, and then some data gathering methods in the process of our elaboration of laws, for example, I don't know, context analysis or some qualitative or quantitative methods, while we are implementing our daily routine in the elaborations of law? Or do you think it's better to have a specialized committee at the parliament in order to data gathering? And lastly, I would like to ask that I'm listening to someone else, I'm sorry. But lastly, I would like to ask if it's possible to consider that digital world and the digitalization of parliaments, for me, it's closely connected to this methodology, because if we need to gather data, we really need to go towards digitalization, because most of the data gathering methods are connected to digitalization. So my last question would be maybe applying methodology finally to our legislation methods implies also the necessity to go towards the digitalization. That's all. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to listen to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Valeria. And well, now we have a lot of questions in our chat that I would like to read. They are in Spanish, so I will read them in Spanish. La implementación de un análisis previo o el escrutinio post-legislativo requieren de estructuras fijas dentro de los órganos legislativos. Fuera del propio poder legislativo, ¿o es mejor dejarlo librado a que cada legislador lo haga por sí mismo? ¿Cuáles son los mecanismos para garantizar la imparcialidad en los análisis, informes, investigaciones que sirven de insumos para los legisladores? Esta es una pregunta de Mariano. Y tenemos también una pregunta que ha enviado Juan. ¿Se puede considerar que existe un modelo de gestión parlamentaria orientado a resultados? En ese caso, si lo hubiera, ¿qué parlamentos estarían más avanzados en su implementación? Y en el chat de todo este Zoom, de esta conversación, tenemos también otra pregunta que dice, good afternoon, can you mention again the scientific method and its creator that is used for legislative creation? Y después, buenas tardes, quisiera saber la opinión de Lorna sobre la capacitación previa de los candidatos al Parlamento para ocupar sus cargos y la continuación de la misma mientras permanecen en sus cargos a fin de tener un cuerpo legislativo mejor formado. Entonces, vamos a dejar este segmento de preguntas y respuestas hasta acá, pero le damos la palabra a Lorna para que pueda dar respuesta a las preguntas y comentarios tan interesantes que se han hecho en esta conversación. Lorna, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's a wide variety of questions there. I must say I really personally like the digital democracy questions, digital parliament questions. Several, I guess, a bit about my personal history. I have been teaching parliamentary strengthening for about 2 decades. About 10 years ago, I wanted to see how some of the work that we'd been doing was actually being applied. So some of the capacity building work and the strategies that we've been using around the world, were people saying, wow, this is great. And then in reality, going back to their jobs and not using any of the tools. Were they using the tools? If so, were they working? You know, I want to do that form of analysis of our own interventions. And I got a range of responses. In some countries, I got the, of course I use this, and of course it works. Everything's perfect response, which I found a little bit mind-numbing. I thought, wow, they must be really good at using this method. And I also got the, I try, but we don't have any data, and I have to draft really quickly response. And I've been focused on that one, because if you try to use the methodology that I was introducing really quickly, so you can't really see how it works exactly, but if you use it sort of intuitively on the basis of your own personal understanding of the question, and you don't actually do the research, it is no longer evidence-based, right? It's intuitive, or based on one person's engagement with the world and personal knowledge of issues, right? So in a situation where you don't have access to reports, or you don't trust your government's reports for whatever reason, you're not, you can follow this method and it will work you through the logic. Now, the logic in and of itself will actually take care of a lot of problems, but it will not be evidence-based. So I started thinking about the question of developing ways to make sure that there was a data pipeline, so that when these issues got to the legislative staff or the members of parliament, that the information that they would need to make informed decisions was available to them, and was available in a form that would be easy for them to use. I also started thinking about, since I work with civic participation a lot, and I work at law schools and other like public policy programs, the question of how do you engage students in the research process? A lot of the countries I've been working in, they don't have congressional research services like we do in the United States. They do not have a giant stable of well-trained researchers who are available to spend their time doing this type of work. So the question is both, how do you access that type of capacity? Does it exist somewhere in your society? Can you access it? And how do you build it as an institution? And one of the answers to that question has been university students. They require training though. So for years I taught a distance course, and distance training, as we all probably know from the pandemic, is a bit difficult at times. But trying to give feedback to everybody guiding their projects through was very time consuming. So trying to oversee this myriad of projects around the world and provide input on how they could, what questions they might ask, where they might go for information, was just really time consuming. So what I tried to do is to develop a digital platform that would structure the process to sort of have the information that they were going to need at various points in this process available when they were at that point in the process. So it'd be just right off to the side, and then also to come up with templates that would cue people to analyze their own work to look for certain factors. And the idea of this was that it would streamline this process and make it easier to manage a group of relatively new researchers. So these could be junior staff members, or these could be students, and to help guide them through the process of gathering this type of information and putting it into a basic format that members of parliament could look at, or even drafting the bills for them, so that that work would be done, because it is a large burden. So we're still sort of field testing some of these instruments to see how they work, but that was definitely part of why I've spent the last several years looking at IT a lot, is trying to overcome this problem of how do you actually do evidence-based drafting. You need to have good information. You need to have relevant information. So a lot of the information that you might be gathering with your National Statistics Office is not necessarily the most relevant information when it comes to, for instance, facilitating behavioral change. So how do you come up with relevant information? How do you gather, guide new researchers through this process and provide them with tools so that they can navigate it fairly independently? Recently, I was on a working group for my local community. And the question was, how do we increase civic engagement in local government decision-making processes? And, they're talking there about, okay, we want to hold, various working groups and things like that. Part of the question I was raising is, well, how can we use online tools to facilitate this process? So to think about things like, how do you have collaborative issue identification? So how do you collaboratively and online talk about what are the problems that we are experiencing? Now, one of the people who just asked a question, and I don't think I was fast enough at taking notes here, but was talking about the role of social media. Social media is obviously a two-edged sword. On the somewhat positive side of social media, we have things like some of the Twitter campaigns. We had Yes, All Women, and in the United States, or I guess globally now, Black Lives Matter. These were two campaigns that managed to elicit a lot of information from people in sort of easy soundbite form about different problems they had personally experienced. And it kind of helps you get the sense of the scope of some of these problems and the nature of some of these problems. That sort of tool also, if you're going to run it through like a natural language processing program, could give you the distribution of where are there, what types of problems are the most pervasive, what behaviors are the most pervasive. So I started structuring for a local government a portal that we could use that is very loosely based on the Citizens Foundation's portal they use for Greater Reactive, but that's really more about, well, very loosely based on that. That is thinking about how do you get people to submit their understanding of the problem in a way that other people will help translate that into a testable hypothesis. Because what I think that we do, certainly with social media, but just in general, is we have an idea of the way the world works based on our experience. And if something terrible happens to me, I might generalize that to project that it's happening to all of you, right? Which may not be the case. I may be literally the only person on the planet who the horrible thing has happened to. If I am the only person on the planet who the horrible thing has happened to, it's bad, but it's not something legislation should address, right? Whereas if everybody is suffering or a large number of people are suffering from a similar harm, or if it's a really serious problem, then it's a point where you actually want to step in and think about how do we address that in a sort of systematic way, right? So, I've been thinking about how do we elicit that sort of basic input about here are my things that concern me in a way that we can use them as testable hypotheses, not necessarily questioning whether it happened to that person, but how severe is this and how pervasive is this? And do a lot of this in a sort of distributive knowledge generation format. And again, this is probably deep, almost direct democracy that I'm talking about, but it is something that I've been really curious about on the side of conducting the research so that the members of parliament can have the information and can make evidence-based decisions. So those are obviously things I'm interested in. When it comes to the question of members of parliament communicating with their constituents through social media, I agree that to the extent that that is subsuming all their time now, it is probably going to distract them from doing the real work of parliament. It seems that it puts them in a public relations role rather than a problem-solving role potentially. And what we see here is an increasing turn towards sort of making, I'm going to say ludicrous statements in the hopes of getting attention, likes, media coverage, things like that. And as partially a result of this, we're seeing increasing political polarization in our society. People are also opting into their own sort of information ecosystems and feedback loops, which put them further and further into their camp of people who say things that are the types of things they want to read, which may or may not reflect their experiences. So I think there are all sorts of questions about ways that we can use technology to help break people out of that, where we can give them a media feed of essentially verified information that maybe won't challenge their perspective, which would be the equivalent of, if I want to know basic background of an issue, maybe I want to do the equivalent of looking at Wikipedia, right? Or scholarly journals, or something from the government, something that for some reason I think is maybe pretty neutral in many ways. But then after I look at that thing which is neutral, which for me would probably be my own political perspective, plus things that actually were neutral are going to appear neutral to me, I would also want to look at the perspectives of people with radically different experiences that, again, in some way had already been verified. So I'm not talking about crazy people who are making stuff up, but people who just live in different fact patterns or worry about different things than me. And so before I would finalize my policy, I would obviously want to see what they're saying. So to have some ability to tap into different perspective groups. This is almost a distributive corporatist model. So how do we know what the different perspectives are and have them influence our thinking? So a lot of this technology is not currently in existence, or at least used in this particular way. But when it comes to the Parliament of the future, there are certainly a lot of possibilities for using technology in a way that breaks through some of our current technological growing pains and increases its ability to channel verifiable information towards members of Parliament representing different perspectives. We also see projects like Stanford University has been running a deliberative polling project where basically they will conduct the background research on issues of the day. They will get representative samples of the population, and they will bring these basically apolitical citizens in together to go over the compiled information about the issue and debate it with each other. What they are finding is that these groups will wind up maybe with a 50-50 split on their opinions of the issue. And after having actually read the evidence and gone through the deliberative process, they wind up 80-20. So it is sort of another version of Parliament that we could be going towards. And I don't know, as far as predicting the future, I don't know that we get rid of parliaments, but the deliberative polling process is essentially what parliaments were originally designed to do, which is taking issues, looking at them in depth, discussing them with people, and changing their minds or their paradigms or their solutions according to those discussions. It is something that people are generally pretty equipped to do if you give them the right inputs, which again looks at the research service side or the information generation side. I'm trying to think which many questions I have missed and I run through these really quickly. Okay, as far as mechanisms to guarantee impartiality within the post-legislative scrutiny process. One of the things that is intended to guarantee impartiality is at the front of a post-legislative scrutiny process. I would actually move this somewhat forward to when you're drafting your bill and trying to embed some of this in your monitoring and evaluation system. But if you haven't done this, when you start a post-legislative scrutiny process, you need to identify who's going to participate. And among the participants, you want to have people representing the different affected groups. We kind of quickly ran through that. You want to identify the bill's objectives. So post-legislative scrutiny is not about sort of opening up the political debate again. It is about saying, is this law doing what it was specifically designed to do? So from that perspective, you're going to say, okay, how do we sort of forensically figure out what the specific objectives are here and develop clear indicators? You want them to be as data-driven as possible and as concrete as possible, using potentially smart indicators. So indicators that are very specific, that are measurable. So again, ideally quantitative. that are, were achievable at the time. So what we think would have been a reasonable amount of progress for the implementing agency to make within the time frame.
Lorna, so sorry to interrupt. We have to close in 7 minutes. So if you can,
it was a lot of questions.
2 more minutes, please. Yes, I know.
Yeah, they were good questions, I thought. So, yeah, when you're starting post-legislative scrutiny, thinking about that in terms of how do we develop the group that we're going to view as representative? That's not biased. How do we develop clean indicators that everybody agrees to? If we don't, this is what it's trying to do. If we find this evidence, it proves it was successful. If we find this other evidence, it proves it was ineffective in some way, not successful. And what are credible sources of information? If you outline those things before you begin the research in the PLS process, then everybody has already indicated that they have buy-in to the legitimacy of the answers that come from that research experience. So that is another solution to that, or I guess response to that. As far as, yes, the prediction for the first speaker about whether we will have a digital evolution in parliaments, I think we're already seeing one, but it's not as strong as it could be and as strong as it will be at some point. We certainly can have people participating more in the research process and the policy development process. It's actually not difficult. We can have people doing what I believe Brazil is already doing about submitting their questions for members of parliament in a format that we use natural language processing to pull the top questions to the top of the list. And so that those are the ones that are addressed first, the ones that are most commonly asked. That might take care of some of the problem with the sort of constant social media, everybody asking questions, thinking the MP is on duty 24 hours a day. So I guess I will close with that.
Thank you so much. I think this has been a wonderful conference. I believe that we are still benefiting from all these virtual learning. So thank you so much, Lorna. Well, I was asked to make some final remarks, and I prefer to do that in my own language, in Spanish. Hoy, por un lado, y ya lo comentaba tanto Lorna como Anders Johnson, tenemos dos partes importantes de la ecuación. Por un lado, la erosión en la confianza pública, que en algunos casos, particularmente en América Latina, yo creo que es bien merecido. Los indicadores de corrupción, la ineficiencia gubernamental, la falta de servicios públicos, la creciente desigualdad, desde luego traen consecuencias sociales. Y esto ha hecho que la confianza de la gente, como lo había comentado Juan, en la democracia, pero también en las instituciones parlamentarias, sea evidente y me parece difícil de combatir también. Pero por otro lado, también se conversaba sobre qué pasa del lado de los ciudadanos. ¿Los ciudadanos somos capaces de tener mejores políticos? Yo creo que sí. Yo creo que tiene que ver con ejercicios de rendición de cuentas, de participación ciudadana y con democracias mucho más inclusivas. Hablamos mucho de cómo la pandemia puede o ha podido generar nuevos retos para los parlamentos en estos últimos 2 años. Y creo que si bien los retos, muchos de ellos ya estaban ahí, como el cambio climático, la desigualdad, la corrupción, la pandemia llevó para atrás muchos de los indicadores de desarrollo, echó para atrás muchos de los avances en materia de bienestar, ha contaminado más nuestros océanos y nuestros continentes. En fin, hay una serie de retos que sí tenemos que enfrentar. Y me parece que uno muy importante es lo que hemos aprendido también de la digitalización. Durante estos 2 años se aceleraron los comercios digitales, los métodos de enseñanza virtuales, por eso estamos hoy acá, Y también se ha cuestionado mucho las prácticas tradicionales, incluso en materia de salud, y cómo podemos utilizar las herramientas tecnológicas para hacer la salud mucho más accesible para todos. Creo que ahí está uno de los retos. ¿Cómo tomamos la agenda que venimos acarreando y que no hemos sabido solucionar? ¿Cómo incorporamos los retos que ha planteado la pandemia para hacer una recuperación mucho más integral y que tenga bases más sólidas? Una recuperación que todavía no está claro que podamos decir post pandemia, porque pues vemos que en muchos lugares, por el contrario, han incrementado los casos, como en Europa, pero sí tenemos que diseñar cuál va a ser nuestra ruta económica de salida. Si no lo hacemos, la inflación va a seguir siendo la constante en muchos países del mundo y eso va a seguir deteriorando los salarios y el poder adquisitivo de la gente, particularmente de los más pobres. Si no hacemos un plan de recuperación sostenible con una visión muy clara sobre cómo vamos a frenar el cambio climático, pues nuestra siguiente crisis no va a ser un virus, sino un número importante de muertes y de desplazados a causa del cambio climático y de países enteros que pueden desaparecer. Y ahí está también, me parece, una crisis institucional que afecta desde luego y es un reto para los parlamentos. Durante esta pandemia, algunos gobiernos decidieron ampliar sus poderes en detrimento de las libertades y derechos ciudadanos. Algunos utilizan aplicaciones sobre pretexto de monitorear los contagios para estar revisando con mucho más detalle las conductas de la gente, incluso en patrones que pudieran ser considerados como datos personales sujetos a protección de leyes. Y con esto van a venir, insisto, temas que se han acelerado mucho más. Está ya el debate sobre qué va a pasar con estas nuevas tecnologías que conocen más sobre nuestros pensamientos. Toda la información que damos a todos los mecanismos de comunicación que estamos utilizando, desde el teléfono celular, la computadora, las distintas aplicaciones que utilizamos, todo eso habla hasta de nuestros pensamientos. Y hasta ahora solo un país, Chile, ha presentado las iniciativas y ha tenido un debate serio sobre cómo vamos a proteger el libre albedrío, los pensamientos de la gente. Entonces, en conclusión, los retos que tenemos, me parece, para este siglo son retos que incorporan las tecnologías, que plantean de nueva cuenta la urgente defensa de la democracia y los derechos humanos, me parece, horizontalización de la democracia, cómo generamos instituciones mucho más inclusivas, mucho más incluyentes, donde todas las voces puedan sentirse representadas. Creo que esta ha sido una charla fantástica, extraordinaria, donde tenemos distintos lados. Una perspectiva científica que nos permite sistematizar la toma de decisiones en los parlamentos, que nos permite también entender cómo funcionan los poderes legislativos, pero al mismo tiempo también una reflexión sobre los retos que tenemos hoy y hacia el futuro. A veces decimos que del pasado solo hay que aprender y hay que tener un ojo siempre mirando hacia el pasado para no repetir los mismos errores. Pero no podemos mantener nunca la mirada en el ayer, sino por el contrario, en lo que podemos hacer hoy y para ser la generación que transforma a este planeta. Yo estoy convencida de que sí se puede. Hay 46.552 parlamentarios en el planeta que pueden hacer esta tarea. Y creo que el centro, los planteamientos que ha hecho la Universidad Austral, el debate y la profesionalización sobre el quehacer parlamentario son una gran iniciativa, no solo para Argentina, sino para toda América Latina y el Caribe, y esperemos, como ya lo hemos comentado en ocasiones anteriores, esto pueda llevarse a todos los rincones del planeta. Muchas felicidades a todas las autoridades de la universidad que están involucrados en este esfuerzo. Enhorabuena, que sea el primero de muchos éxitos. Lorna, it has been amazing to hear you, to learn from you. I hope that we can coincide much more in the future. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you very much. I think this conversation is only the first step for a lot of homework, not only internationally, but also at the domestic arena. Thank you so much. And I would like to give the floor back to the university authorities. I think you are the right ones to close this session. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Gabriela. No, simplemente el agradecimiento a Lorna Seitz, a Gabriela Cuevas Barrón y a todos los participantes, Anders Johnson, Fotis Fitsilis, bueno, a todos los que han participado. Hemos tenido también la participación de muchos legisladores de distintas partes de América Latina. Así que gracias a todos, en nombre de la Escuela de Gobierno de la Universidad Austral y en particular del CIDEIP, aquí con mi colega, el director adjunto del centro, Mariano Palacios. Les agradecemos mucho su tiempo y les deseamos un muy buen resto del día y buen fin de semana. Adiós a todos, nos vemos muy pronto. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Hasta luego.
A todos. Gracias, Lorna. See you soon. Thank you.